Welcome to the Bluestocking Circle podcast, Lady Nerds on Popular Culture. We're your hosts, Griselle
and B.
This is episode 22, Labyrinth. In today's episode, we will be discussing the 1986 Jim Henson film, Labyrinth, starring David Bowie and Jennifer Connelly. We are also joined by our second guest ever, Kat, who is also the newbie for this episode. So welcome, Kat.
Welcome.
Hello.
Yay. Before we begin, know that we will spoil all the things. Labyrinth is a cult classic, so if you haven't seen it, turn back. You have 13 hours in which to secure a copy. Released in 1986, Labyrinth banked on little more than name recognition. The original trailer provides very little context, but makes it clear that this is a collaboration between Jim Henson, George Lucas, and David Bowie. That's it. The film received mixed reviews, earning high praise from the New York Times, whose reviewer called it a fabulous film about a young girl's journey into womanhood, and a mythic-style tale, to a scathing review from Gene Siskel of the Chicago Tribune, who called it an enormous waste of talent and money. I'm not sure how it became the cult classic it is today, but I have no doubt it was due in part to the magic combination of talents behind the film. To this day, Labyrinth is a favorite among children and adults alike, despite its lackluster reception at the box office. It's weird, it's zany, and it's very dark for a children's film. In other words, it's very 80s. So let's get to it. So let's start with our newbie synopsis. Kat?
An imaginative teen girl, Sarah, is stuck babysitting her baby brother. In a moment of weakness, she wishes for goblins to take him away, and to her surprise, it actually happens. She is confronted by the Goblin King, played by David Bowie wearing very thin pants, who tells her she has 13 hours to traverse a magical labyrinth to reach the castle where her brother now resides. Along the way, she meets helpful and not so helpful residents of the labyrinth, and happily she does not fall under the sexual spell of Jareth, the Goblin King. In the end, her baby brother is safe in his crib, and Sarah has a menagerie of new friends from her journey.
That's actually a better synopsis than what IMDb provides, which is just like, a girl's brother is taken away and she must go through a labyrinth. Thank you. Would you like our listeners to know anything about you before we get started?
This movie represents a black hole in my pop culture knowledge. I have shocked and surprised many people when I tell them I have never seen it. So I was happy to be given this assignment and experience a fandom that has been recommended to me countless times.
I don't know how you managed to escape it, but
I know.
We'll forgive you for that. So you also got to be the very second recipient of our pop culture pop quiz, but don't worry, there's no need to study. So I'll give you a series of questions and you can answer them however you see fit. So firstly, because we must grill you on this, what are your favorite fandoms?
First and foremost, everything comes down to The Simpsons for me. I've been watching the show for the entirety of its 30-year run, and it quite literally built my knowledge of pop culture and comedy.
So you're the anti-Ashley is what you're saying.
Yes, I was shocked that she had never seen a full episode.
Nope, not a single one.
May I add that
crazy.
You're currently wearing a Bart Simpson jean jacket that you made yourself?
Yes.
And it's a very good one too.
It's
Thank
great.
you. It's a pride and joy of mine. Little House on the Prairie books is another one for me. That whole series I got as a child, and they were consistent favorites. They also laid the groundwork for my love of history and historical fiction.
I've actually never read those.
Really?
Really? Oh, I'm shocked.
Future episode opportunity.
I love them. I don't know how they would read now if you didn't read them as a child, but they do go into her adulthood, so it's kind of nice to read the whole series, and it's not just a children's themed book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see
adult themes.
I can see becoming a history buff from having read those, because yes.
I was obsessed with learning everything I could about that time period, and yes. And then a couple more. So Stephen King is a huge one for me. Through middle school and high school, those were all of the books that I read, and it taps into my love of the macabre and horror.
I was not a huge Stephen King fan, but I did have a friend who was really into him, so I did read most of it at one point.
Yes.
I mean, most of his earlier stuff. Obviously, he's continued writing, and I have not followed, but
I've actually read some of his newer books, mostly things that are continuations of his older books. He came out with a sequel to The Shining, and that was actually pretty good, I thought.
What would you recommend as an entry point for Stephen King?
I think that Carrie is a really good one, although it's sort of a strange novel in that it's told through many different ways, through the characters and then through newspaper articles. But I think that one is a pretty good entry point. It's also not too long, which a lot of his other works can be huge, huge pieces of work. So if you're not into it, it's kind of a lot to dedicate like 600 pages to something.
That was one of our Matilda reading recs, and I've never read it. So
really?
I think you just gave me homework.
Yes. I actually appreciate that you guys recommended that, just in terms of telekinesis. It fits.
How have you never read Carrie? I thought that was like a thing you would have read.
I've read Under the Dome, which I really liked, and I think that's about it.
Oh, really? I think it is pretty good as well, although there's some weird stuff at the end of that book. And the new movie adaptation was pretty good, and I'm sort of excited to see the new one because it's in 2 parts. And then one more. I don't know if this is like a traditional fandom, but I would say Hitchcock movies.
Ooh.
From a really young age, I would watch all Hitchcock movies with my mom, and we even watched the show Alfred Hitchcock Presents. If something is described as Hitchcockian to me, that will immediately pique my interest, and I want to watch it or read it.
I've described B as Hitchcockian.
Have you?
What a compliment!
In your sneaky ways. Like, this is very Rear Window of you.
That's one of the nicest things anyone has ever said to me. What would you consider the Hitchcock entry points?
I would definitely say Vertigo. Mm-hmm. I think it has a lot of aspects of his movies. I think it's also sort of a movie about making movies. And Jimmy Stewart is definitely my favorite Hitchcock lead.
Yes, me too. I love Jimmy Stewart.
Yes. I think Rear Window is another really good entryway. Mm-hmm. I think that everyone can kind of get into that one. It's a little more straightforward in its plot. Plus, who doesn't love spying on their neighbors? And Grace Kelly is probably my favorite Hitchcock lead, female lead.
That movie has my favorite costume designs, I think.
So beautiful. Yeah. The scene where she just like appears before Jimmy Stewart and the lens is covered in Vaseline. But she just looks so beautiful.
I love our Vaseline lenses. Who is your OTP?
So I am not a romantic shipper type of person. I typically don't really like romantic stories. But I would say my all-time is Anne and Gilbert from Anne of Green Gables.
That is very sweet.
I second everything.
Yes. So I've never been one to sort of like wish for people to get together more than Anne and Gilbert. And I was always so happy. Whenever I reread, it still makes me happy that they get together. And I love that their relationship is built on mutual respect. Yes. And he admires her intelligence and encourages her to learn more, which is special to me.
We do love Ellen Montgomery. So for your final question, who are some of your favorite heroines?
Lisa Simpson, obviously. She's sarcastic, she loves books, and she's obnoxiously vocal about speaking up for what she believes in. So she'll always be my number 1. But Jane Eyre is a close second. Another bookworm. So that's definitely a running theme with my heroines. And on that note, Anne Shirley is definitely up there. The last one is maybe problematic, but Scarlett O'Hara.
I do love Scarlett. Scarlett is my favorite anti-hero type person.
You've got a major Gone with the Wind fan sitting next to you.
Okay, same. I read that book maybe every single year throughout middle school and high school, and I've seen the movies so many times.
I didn't read it until I was in college, and we were reading Daniel Deronda, and one of my classmates was saying how Daniel Deronda and Gone with the Wind shared a lot of similarities. And she was like, but you have to read this book. I was like, okay. And then, yeah, it was hooked.
I love Scarlett. I know she's selfish and kind of a brat.
Yep.
But she also sort of taught me what not to do in a lot of situations. And I think the number one thing for that is to not spend years pining after someone who is stringing you along and who has no actual romantic intentions for you.
I can agree. That's a good lesson to learn.
Yeah. And you know what? She's actually pretty smart in the books, and she's a good businesswoman. So.
Yes, I think in the books they do obviously Margaret Mitchell wrote it, so the film adapts, but the book reveals so much more about her character than the film does.
If you like the movie, I think you would like the book, actually, because it does just give more context to everything.
It's a quick read, I would say. It's a huge book, but it does read quickly.
Yes.
Well, I'd say you passed that test. So
with flying colors, welcome.
Yay.
So let's dive into our origin stories. My origin story for Labyrinth starts before I could speak, essentially. Labyrinth is up there with Star Wars in the list of movies that have been a part of my life since infancy. I don't remember this, but the story goes that my mom had a pair of neighbors who sat for her when I was a baby. And they were older, they had grandkids, so I was added into the mix of children whenever they decided to watch the grandkids. They introduced me to the best of 80s sci-fi and fantasy, and Labyrinth was among them. I watched it constantly growing up, except for a brief period when I was too cool for school. And I kind of got over myself around 8th grade and reverted back to the fantasy nerd I was at heart. So basically, Labyrinth is my fandom origin story.
Labyrinth is your everything origin story, Crystal.
It is! It really is!
My origin for Labyrinth is quite a bit more recent, because growing up, I did watch a lot of 1950s and 1960 movies because of my parents, and a lot of 1990s and 2000 movies because of me. But the 70s and 80s are, for the most part, huge gaps in my pop culture knowledge, a few exceptions like The Princess Bride and Spaceballs aside. So I never watched Labyrinth as a kid, but as I've mentioned before, I did briefly subscribe to cable after college solely to watch the Futurama revival. And while I did, I watched a whole bunch of movies I hadn't seen before, and Labyrinth was among them. I'd vaguely heard of it before, and I had assumed it was a straightforward fantasy movie from the description, but it is not. I was definitely not expecting puppets. And as I said in the last mini-sode...
What were you expecting if you were not expecting puppets?
I was expecting something along the lines of maybe Legend.
Okay.
No puppets.
Okay.
I didn't see the Jim Henson
okay.
name anywhere there.
So you were not drawn in by the names of this film?
I just saw magic, young girl, adventure, portal fantasy, and thought that was good enough.
Okay.
And then it's not just that, is it?
Nope. No, it is not.
And as I said in the last mini-sode, I did think it was strange and off-putting when I saw it then, and I didn't really care for it. But we'll see if my opinion has changed, won't we?
How old were you when you saw this?
I don't know, 22, 23?
I don't know if that's the entry point for Labyrinth.
So I didn't grow up watching a lot of sci-fi or fantasy, and now as an adult, I definitely veer more towards the sci-fi. Like B, I also have a lot of gaps from the 80s in my movie knowledge. For example, I just saw Indiana Jones for the first time earlier this year.
What did you people watch when you were children?
1960s Disney musicals.
Yeah. Alfred Hitchcock stuff. But I was a huge David Bowie fan, and my dad is a big fan, so I grew up listening to his music. So my knowledge of this movie revolves solely around David Bowie, and I didn't even realize that he also acted until I got to high school. I was a theater geek in high school, so as you might imagine, a lot of my friends loved this movie and recommended it to me. However, both because movies weren't as easy to get on demand back then, and because I have a contrarian personality, I never sought out the movie, and I resolved myself to be a fan only of David Bowie's music. I'll say that I also really didn't like the look on the cover of this movie. David Bowie's whole Tina Turner wig kind of turned me off, and I just didn't really like the Dark Crystal movie, so I thought it would be more in line with that. Ironically, I did learn that Brian Froud did the design work for this movie, and I actually really loved his artwork as a high schooler and collected and always bought his calendars of fairy artwork. So when I learned that he did all of the designs, I kind of felt like a hypocrite for not liking the look of the movie when I already previously liked his artwork. I also thought this movie was going to be a straightforward fantasy movie, so I was actually pretty taken aback when it has when it's revealed to have a contemporary setting. The scene where she's running through the field and then rips off the dress and has pants on underneath and is going through a neighborhood, I was just like, oh, you got me, movie.
So you, like B, were completely wrong about what you were getting into.
I don't know what I thought it was. But I am happy that I finally saw it, and I can now be a more complete David Bowie fan, who I found to be an absolute delight in this movie. I really don't know who else they could have gotten to play the Goblin King. David Bowie definitely has that otherworldly personality and look and aspect to his whole being, and yet he also has a lot of humanity, so I feel like he's perfect for that role.
I think so too. Some of the other singers who were in the running for this included Prince and Michael Jackson, so imagine how different this could have been.
No.
I think Freddie Mercury was also among the list, but yeah, it was an interesting list of singers that were tagged for this film, and I am very glad they went with Bowie, because yes, I think he's got that airy-fairy look to him.
Yes.
So I think we're good to dive into our ship wars and get the conversation started. As I've said before, this movie is my all and everything. So if you ask me what my OTP is, I will answer Jareth Sarah. And when I say Labyrinth is my fandom origin, I absolutely mean it. In the early days of the internet, before AO3 and Tumblr and all that, I was deep into Yahoo groups and fanfiction.net, and I basically read all the Labyrinth fanfic that was available. And a lot of it, I will say, is actually really good. A lot of it is still out there, and I've reread it since then, at least some of the really nostalgic favorites that I had, and they're still decent. However, I will admit that the best fics all take place when Sarah is an adult, and often returning to the Labyrinth for reasons of her own, or because she's some sort of chosen one to take over the throne. There's a lot of fairy lore involved in this fandom, and I still ship it. But I can admit that the relationship is problematic as depicted in the film. Jareth is a manipulative fairy king brat, and Sarah is 15. Jennifer Connelly was 14. So yeah, problematic. I do blame it on David Bowie's sultry songs. And I'm looking at you, Ballroom Jareth, with your tight pants.
Before we start worrying, I have to say, Crystal, this is an adorable side of you we've never seen before.
What do you mean?
I'm just picturing...
Are you saying I am not adorable normally?
I'm just picturing your tiny self on Yahoo groups, and it is the cutest image.
I would be on there all night long. There was no sleeping when I was a child. So B, please give it to me. Shipboard.
I think you know what I'm going to say.
Do I though?
Yeah, well, I'm glad they don't force a romance. Thankfully, it's all left as an implication that you can explore on fanfic posted on Yahoo groups at a later date. But I can't get over the age difference that you pointed out. She was 14, you said?
14, yes, is what I have read.
He was 40. I looked it up.
I know
she
this.
is a child, and he is an adult, and not a young adult. He is a middle-aged adult. She could be his child very easily. So I can't ship it in any way, shape, or form. Maybe there's a version of this movie in an alternate universe where she's 17 years old and he's maybe 19 or 20, like in Beauty and the Beast, for example. And maybe in that universe, I don't hate the idea of the ship, but I'm not in that universe. I'm in this one, and I find it very creepy and nope.
I can understand. I really can.
I am curious, though, how much has fanfic shaped your perception of this ship? For example, do you ship it because of the movie itself or because of these extracurricular stories that you've been reading all these years?
I would say it's a little bit of both. I will also... I think I've mentioned this off the air, but when I was a child and I would watch this film, I thought David Bowie was a woman. Just saying. So as a child, I thought this was a story about a young girl and some sort of like magic witch. Mm-hmm. It was not until I was an older child watching it again that I was like, wait a minute, that's not what I thought this was about. I can't remember exactly when it became a romantic relationship to me because I really was just way too young to draw back on that memory. Somehow it just always had that like magic fairy quality to it. I do think that the shipping aspects were probably more influenced by fan fiction. So yeah, I can say that as an adult, I probably came to the fan fiction aspects of it a little bit more.
Interesting.
Well, for me, one of the few things that I knew about this movie before I watched it was that basically all of my female friends and some of my male friends all loved Jareth. And seeing this movie definitely awakened something within them. So I was actually expecting it to be a lot more romantic in the movie, but I was happy that it wasn't because, like B, I just can't get over the age difference and the power dynamics between the two of them. I actually found the movie to be sort of an effective example of an unhealthy relationship. Like you said, he is a manipulative character. And the last scene where she tells him that he has no power over her, I thought was really great and empowering, and I wouldn't wish for her to end up with him. I think she deserves a lot better.
I'm actually going to link to an article for a recommended reading later, and it was on Medium, and it was specifically about that, about how Labyrinth has a lot of elements to them that show you what a manipulative relationship looks like and how to get out of one. And
I actually think that's pretty useful for teen girls to see that example and to see that she doesn't fall for it and has the sort of willpower to step away from him.
I do put it up in there with Legend, kind of what B thought this movie was going to be, but it was not. But Legend also has that one scene, that very dark scene where there's sort of like a loss of innocence that happens when she's dancing and she changes.
I saw this so long ago. I don't remember a thing about the movie.
Well, there is a scene where that happens, and I kind of put it up in there with that kind of like dark romance element and the female character kind of coming to terms with that and walking away from it. So I kind of put them on the same level.
Have you seen Legend, Kat?
I have not seen Legend, so sorry, another gap.
We have no idea what you're talking about, so.
Well, to our listeners who have seen Legend and know about the dark loss of innocence scene that happens, you know what I'm talking about. So let's dive into our feminist rant instead. So I'll start with an anti-rant because I kind of expect B to have some actual ranting, maybe. But pretty much Sarah is me. And this is wherein I will explain my fascination with female quest stories and how I always secretly dressed like Sarah when I was a little girl. I had this thing watching this movie, specifically with the Sarah character. I kind of like that whole part at the end where she walks away from this. I found her very empowering as a young girl. There was also her fashion aesthetic that I really liked. And let's just say that I have gone through eBay very often looking for a vest just like Sarah's. There's a lot of girl power in this movie. There's also a lot of friendship, and there's also moments that reveal what toxic people look like and, people who will betray you, people you can trust. So I always found that a really good, empowering aspect of this film. So I don't really have a feminist rant per se. I'd say that it's an actually feminist film in the end. And, aside from the weirdness with Jared and Sarah, but I think a lot of that comes from what the viewer puts into their interpretation of the film. There's more that I have learned through fandom and from the novelization of the film, which I have read pieces of. I have the novelization, but it's very ancient and I am trying to be very gentle with it, so I have not read it all the way through. But fandom lore has a lot of these elements. There's some stuff about Sarah's mother, and if she is not dead, I will tell B that. Because her mother is not dead. Her mother left her. So there's stuff about the Jareth relationship there, and if you look very carefully in her room, everything in her room is what she encounters in the Labyrinth, including the pictures of David Bowie that are on her mirror, who is playing her mother's boyfriend or romantic lead in a play. Her mother's an actress, so the stuff she's acting out is stuff that her mother has acted. If you look through her room, there's pictures of cats and other plays and things. So there is some assumption in both fandom interpretation that Jareth is the person he is because that's what she sees as the one who took her mother away. There's weirdness about abandonment issues and relationships and connection to the mother.
I'm coming to an epiphany as you're speaking. I think my Labyrinth is the 10th Kingdom.
Yes. When I was actually going through the notes and seeing what connections could be made, yes. You can compare Virginia and Sarah and the mothers in many ways because there's a lot of abandonment issues and how you deal with your abandonment through this fantasy world. And there's a lot of interpretations of Labyrinth that take it into Jungian psychology and going into the depths of your mind and all that. So I don't have a rant. I actually think this is a really good coming-of-age story for a female character. But I'll let you guys do some ranting.
Well, you preempted that dead mother rant right there.
Oh, wow.
And I sort of second her fashion choices based on my previous mention of Anne Shirley. I do love a puffed sleeve.
One enjoys a puffed sleeve, indeed.
And I actually really loved her shoes. She's wearing a very sensible loafer throughout the movie.
Yes. Jeans?
And yes.
Yes, never a bizarre bra thing for battle.
So I feel a little cheated because Feminist Rant is my favorite part of the show.
I love that you have a favorite part of the show.
And I don't have much to rant about for this movie. I actually found the movie to be very unusual in its portrayal of Sarah as a teen girl, sort of navigating teenage and womanhood and how she deals with being in between those two worlds. I sort of dislike the term late bloomer, but I'm going to go ahead and begrudgingly use it to describe myself in high school. And so when her stepmother tells her that she should be out dating boys, it sort of really resonated to me because I, in high school, was much like Sarah and preferred to be alone in my room and sort of live in an imaginative world. I thought the movie was going to be sort of a more standard story of letting go of your childhood and sort of putting aside all of your toys and dolls and playing dress up. And throughout the movie, it kind of was hinting at that. With the junk lady, she kind of is telling Sarah, don't you want these things? And giving her all of the items from her room. And Sarah tells us, oh, no, it's junk, and throws it. So it's like, oh, she has to abandon all of that and she had to give up sort of her childhood desires and move on to adulthood. But I was really surprised at the end of the movie that it didn't turn out that way, and that when she looks in the mirror and she says, I don't know why, but I'll always still need you, and turns around and all of her companions are there wearing party hats for some reason.
The most 80s part of this movie.
It was really sweet, and I thought it was nice that it accepts that she can be an adult but still have these sort of childlike fantasies, and she didn't really have to fully give up that to be an adult.
I can agree. Yeah, she doesn't have to completely abandon everything that she cares about. She kind of just comes to a realization about herself within that world, but it doesn't have to completely shed that entire persona she's developed. As I was actually doing research for this, since you mentioned the stepmother and the you should go out and find boyfriends, I found this one really old Angel Fire website that somehow still exists. that actually mentioned that very thing about how that is one of the things in this film that was a little odd, that she would be, 15 in the film, but she was between 14 and 15 as they were filming it. And that the stepmother is kind of like forcing this child to like go out and find a guy. And say, what? Why? Leave her alone.
Are we old?
Yeah.
Is that what we think? She seems so young. She's a baby. Leave her to play with her dolls.
Baby. Hey, I was playing with my dolls. I wasn't playing with dolls. But I still have stuffed toys. So just saying.
I also should say that I appreciate that the movie allows for Sarah to explore her romantic feelings, but without actually sexualizing the actress, who, as we've mentioned, was very young. I think it was smart to cast a rock star as the Goblin Kings, because it kind of builds on the idea that a lot of young people start off having crushes on movie stars and rock stars who are definitely too old for them, but they're sort of a safe crush because they're far away. And if that person actually reciprocated with feelings, it would be sort of creepy and off-putting. And that's how I find the ballroom scene to be. So I'm sorry to destroy your romantic ideas about that scene. But it's creepy and weird, and everyone's in scary masks. And she runs away for a good reason.
B, please give it to me.
You want to rant?
I do.
Then you're going to be disappointed.
What?
I don't really have much to rant about this time. She's very brave. Sarah is a very brave character. She's a quick thinker, like you pointed out. I think she's a great character for little girls to watch and emulate and dress like.
Well, thank you.
The Dead Mother rant was cut off, as I said. I was prepared to rant about that, but now I can't.
Tell me what you wanted to rant about. I can tell you.
Well, I think it's been a long-standing trend in all the works we've covered that the thing that fiction does with mothers is kill them off.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad this movie found an alternate route, even though it did write her off, which isn't great either. But there is one point that I think still holds, and that's the fact that everyone in the Goblin world seems to be male.
Yes.
Except for the junkyard woman.
Yes, most of the characters are male. I assume a lot of girls have wished away their baby brothers over time. Because that's what they are. They're baby brothers that have been turned into goblins.
Well, that makes sense, but I think I've been quite clever to have Ludo revealed as a female towards the end, perhaps.
Maybe.
Something like that. There was no reason that every single goblin needed to be male. It could have been nice to have a female companion for Sarah in this goblin world.
I will say that in fanfiction there have been female characters created, but...
Of course, because it's women writing the fanfiction for the most part, as opposed to the male writers.
Female goblins in fanfiction.
That's it. That's all I have,
Well,
Grisel.
that's a very mild rant. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed some of it. And you did not have to increase your dead parent tally. And I'll also add, before we wrap it up, that speaking of practical elements of this film and how the female character is portrayed wearing sensible shoes and everything else, she also uses her very grown-up lipstick to mark the ground.
That was a nice touch.
I like that too.
Just, have the little guys flipping it over. That's another problem, but, So let's go into our catharsis corner. Now, after that very mild-mannered feminist rant that we had that involved very little ranting, do we have much to cathart? I don't particularly. But that is because I can never dislike this movie. I just love it entirely. There is something I do want to note, however, and that is that while Labyrinth is basically Jim Henson's fever dream, Terry Jones wrote the screenplay. And this is something that I never really gave much thought to, but I absolutely love Monty Python. And if you don't know anything about Monty Python, it was a group of British comedians, including Terry Jones, who got together in 1960 and created some of the absolute zaniest comedy skits and films that you will ever see. And it's a very particular brand of British humor. I enjoy that kind of humor, and Labyrinth is full of it. But I never noticed it until now, and I'm really glad that I did. I think it was because I was watching the movie more consciously in order to critique it that I started to see the connections to, Monty Python and the Holy Grail and some of the skits and other bits and pieces. But I really found myself enjoying the jokes all the more after I made that connection, especially as Sarah encounters the various creatures, including, the various tests that she meets along the way who have rhymes and riddles that make absolutely no sense in anyone's sense of logic. So I will say that. And on a side note, that the battle for the Goblin City was much better executed and more effective than the battle for Winterfell. Shade.
I understood that reference.
And I agree.
So what did you guys think?
I don't really want to cut that, Grisel. I think your devotion to this movie is lovely, and I would much rather devote the time to hearing you fangirl.
I can fangirl for days. But you can go ahead. I'm okay. I can handle it.
Okay, well, I will say then that this movie is not at all my cup of tea. It seems like something I should like on paper, but this isn't a movie that I want to look at. I find it visually unpleasant. And it's not a fault of the movie, of course. It's just that there's a mismatch between the movie's aesthetic, which is rather gloomy and, in my opinion, ugly because of the creature designs, and between my aesthetic, which is, as you know, colorful and pretty things that border on cutesy. And that's it. That's my sole complaint. It isn't my cup of tea. It's not a fault of the movie. It's just that it's not something I want to look at.
Well, that's okay. I can completely understand, because it is a film that I don't think appeals to everyone.
It's an acquired taste. And perhaps I was too old to acquire it when I saw it.
Yeah, I kind of wonder how old or young one has to be to really get into this.
You know, I have my sensitive period of media consumption hypothesis. I think
Yes,
there's
you do.
certain movies that you have to see at a certain age, otherwise you will not like them. Labyrinth, maybe one of them.
Maybe. I will say that my tiny niece has now seen it and apparently enjoys it according to her mother.
Aw.
So I think maybe you have to be of a certain age. But I also think it could creep out tiny children, so...
Yes, I would have been horrified,
I think it depends on the person.
So I actually don't have much to cathart about either. I also found the movie to be really funny, and I was surprised by that, but I guess that's thanks to Terry Jones. I was surprised by it because I have seen Dark Crystal, and I found that movie to be a lot more straightforward and serious as a adventure tale. This movie it made me laugh a lot, so I appreciated that, and it had a lightheartedness to it that I really liked. I really enjoy learning about sort of the behind-the-scenes aspects of movie making, so I did watch some of the special features on the DVD. Seeing the level of work that went into this movie and the amount of practical effects that they used really made me appreciate it all the more. It seemed like they really spent a lot of time building all of the creations, the sets, and everything, and one thing that I dislike about fantasy movies now is that it relies too much on CGI, so I liked looking at that aspect of it. However, I sort of agree with B, and the overall aesthetic of the movie isn't really for me. I found it a little dark and also sort of gloomy, and if I'm going to be going into a fantasy world, I prefer it to be obnoxiously colorful and involve shiny shoes, so...
Kat, you have excellent opinions.
I think what I'm getting here is you two are more Wizard of Oz, whereas I'm more Return to Oz, which B and I have talked about before.
Yes, that's one of two movies that has scared me so much as a child that I ran out of the room screaming and never have seen it again. The other one is Little Mermaid.
Really?
Yes.
Oh my god.
Ursula terrified me beyond all reason as a child.
No, didn't share that.
You love both.
I do.
I do love The Little Mermaid, but I think that if I had seen Labyrinth as a child, I may not have been as that into it. It is kind of scary. The creatures are sort of weird looking, and I don't know, the bog of
Eternal
stench. Yeah, it's so gross. It's just gross.
Basically anuses. That's what they are. Yeah, I do have to admit that it is not the kind of film for everyone. I don't know how the magic combination of things that happened that made me so into it as a child, but I love it and continue to enjoy it. And I have shown it to people who, have had mixed feelings towards it. I have my crew of friends who all enjoy it, so.
Good. I'm glad you have a Labyrinth support system.
I do have, well, it's a very big fandom, so I do not lack for support. I will say, jumping off of Kat's point, I don't like the Dark Crystal either. I actually never saw that as a kid. I saw that as an adult, and I found it incredibly dull. I mean, the creatures move slowly, so the film trudges along just as slowly as the creatures. I thought I would enjoy it because I thought it was in line with Labyrinth, and I did not. I do think I still own it, but I don't like that one. Think slow-moving puppet dinosaur rock-looking creatures.
No, why would I?
That's kind of what it is.
I haven't seen that one either, and I don't think I will based on what you just said.
I don't recommend it. I know that it's regarded as one of Jim Henson's greats, but it's a slow plot. I think he also did it with Brian Froud. I think so,
yes.
I think they were both.
The design looks very similar. Mm-hmm. I have seen it, and there are no human characters. Yep. So that's definitely harder for me to get into, to just watch a movie of straight puppets the whole time. I mean, even the Muppet movies have a large cast of humans that interact with the Muppets. There are seriously
no humans in this film. It's almost like stop motion, but with puppets. Yeah. Like that kind of a theme. Like, it's all just these creations that are running the show.
Yeah. I guess if you're into puppetry, it's sort of amazing that he makes all of these creatures and can make a full movie just with puppets. But for me, I would rather not watch that.
Yeah, it's not my favorite.
I do find the artistry impressive. Those puppets were amazingly done. And you can tell there's a lot of love that goes into that work. It's just not my cup of tea.
It's impressive on so many levels. Watching the behind-the-scenes features, they were having to create basically all new technology. A lot of the puppets were obviously controlled by humans, but some were also controlled animatronically. And so Jim Henson also sort of was a inventor of animatronics.
The collaboration
kind of
between him and George Lucas to get a lot of the effects was really good. One of my favorites in the behind the scenes, I don't know if it's in the version that I have, but it's in one of the versions I've seen. They show how they move the little eyeballs.
Yes,
and
that
it's
was
like
my
this
favorite too.
thing where they control it with like different fingers to move each little eyeball on its own. But everything is a physical effect, including the fire dance, and all that involved like a ton of black velvet to make.
And Jennifer Connelly actually had to do a lot of stunts, including the scene where she's walking across the bridge and the bridge falls and she jumps onto the tree. That was all her. And then the ballroom, when that explodes, she's hanging by wires and flying through the air. So it was impressive too, just the level of dedication the actors had to
and then there was glitter on everything.
Yes.
They sprayed it all with glitter to make it
takes
shine.
forever to clean up.
I was surprised that owl was CGI. I didn't expect a CGI animal that far back in movie history.
Yeah.
And it looks pretty realistic.
I was going to say,
I don't know about that.
It looks not bad. I mean, considering this is the 80s, if you saw CGI, I don't know. It looks okay. It's passable.
Yeah.
It's better than the first Centaur and the first Harry Potter movie.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And that was a lot later. The technology had improved.
I do actually think that this whole world of Labyrinth would be a really fun theme park ride. I don't know why they never created a Jim Henson world, or maybe they did and I just don't know about it. But as she's walking through the labyrinth, and like you were saying, everything is covered in glitter. I was like, I want to walk through that glitter-covered land.
Glitter glam rock world.
Yes. So I like that aspect of it, and I think it would be a really fun ride.
Yeah, there's no theme parks that I know of. Maybe in Japan there's some sort of cafes or something. I can imagine that being a thing. There is, however, I think it's called the Ball of Jareth. It could be the Labyrinth Ball. But there is a ball that happens every year that is themed like the ballroom scene. I think it's now happening in Atlanta. I would have to double check that. I think it used to be in LA for a number of years, but it was probably getting too expensive. I think it's moved to Georgia. I've never been, but I've always wanted to.
GoFundMe. Send Griselle to jarethcon.com.
I need the money for the costuming.
I did learn that the Jim Henson collection of puppets resides in Atlanta. Actually, they have a center for puppetry, which also has a museum, so maybe that's why the ball is moved there.
It could be there, yeah. That's the dream. So let's go into our sock ratings, where, Kat, if you're new to this, we assign a number from 1 to 5 socks for the work. So, Kat, as our newbie, you go first. What did you think of this film?
I will be generous and give it 4 out of 5 socks.
Oh, that's more than I expected.
I did really like it, and I thought it sort of dragged at some points, but the more I think about the movie, the more unique it seems to me, and there aren't a lot of movies like it that sort of deal with a female character in the way that this movie does. So I appreciate that, and I think it's a valuable movie, and I would definitely recommend it to people that I know, especially young girls.
B?
I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5, and it does have a little bit of a Griselle boost there.
Oh.
I think it's fine. There are aspects of this movie that I think are excellent. For example, the Escher room, that was really impressively done. I could watch that scene on a loop for quite a while. But overall, I don't care for this movie, and I don't think I ever need to watch it again. My first impression was supported by rewatching. I still find it strange and off-putting.
It is a strange movie. I think, as you said before, it's a movie for a certain type of aesthetic and interest. Which is me! So, I already said it in Minisode 21.5. I love this movie, and nothing will change that. So, I give it a 5. Always. It's silly, it's magical, it sparked my love of fantasy, especially Wicked Fairies, and David Bowie. And I can sing every song. I won't, but I can.
I think you should.
No, we shouldn't. So now that we're done with our sock ratings, let's dive into our reading recommendations, where you can recommend things that are more to your aesthetic beat. I will begin by saying that there is a novelization of the film, as I mentioned. This is by A.C.H. Smith, and apparently it's been reissued because it used to be a lot harder to find, but I found it available through Barnes & Nobles and several other vendors, so I think they've reissued all the Jim Henson novelization books recently. There is also a manga series called Return to Labyrinth, and there is a more recent comic series by Archaea. I have read the preview of that new comic, but have not read the actual series yet, so I can't say that it's great or not. There was also a Marvel comic that came out in the 80s, and I have all of these things, but have not read them all in their entirety. So read at your own discretion. They're out there if you're a Labyrinth fan and want more. Some works I have read that have a Labyrinth vibe to them include Winter Song by S.J. Jones, which was inspired by Labyrinth and includes some of the problematic stuff, also is heavy into music and Mozart references, if that's what your jive is. It's a dark book. It has a lot of trigger warnings, so just putting it out there. Both Winter Song and Shadow Song, which is the sequel. A Court of Thorn and Roses, which I have mentioned before. I don't remember which episode, but I've mentioned it before on the podcast. The entire series by Sarah J. Maas, but most specifically the first book, which is A Court of Thorns and Roses. It has fairy kings, manipulatives, stuff like that. Jareth, I think, is more of a Tamlin than a Rhysand. If you're an ACOTAR fan, you'll know what I'm talking about. And finally, because we have actually mentioned it already, Legend. It's part of that oeuvre of 80s fantasy films that I loved as a kid, and I think it somewhat reflects the Labyrinth feel. And just for any 80s Bowie fans out there, my favorite of his 80s albums is Scary Monsters and Super Creeps, which dropped in 1980 and features one of my absolute favorite Bowie songs, Teenage Wildlife. You can find it on Spotify.
And I would just like to second that David Bowie recommendation.
Yay!
It has one of my favorite songs, Fashion.
That is a good one too.
I have no Bowie songs to recommend.
That's okay.
But I do have children's fantasy, as usual. I'm going to recommend two of my old favorites this time, and I haven't read them in quite a long while, but I have very fond memories of them, and they do seem Labyrinth-like based on both of these fond memories, and the Wikipedia entries I read to refresh said fond memories. The books are The Princess and the Goblin, and its sequel, The Princess and Curdie by George MacDonald. Both books are about a bold young princess named Irene, who's very Sarah-like in her initiative from what I recall, and also a boy named Curdie who works in the mines. In the first book, they journey through Labyrinth and Goblin Caves underground to save Irene from a forced marriage to the Goblin Prince. In the second book, Irene and Curdie save the day again, but in what I remember as being a much more somber and mature work as the characters grow older. The books were written in the late 19th century, so both are in the public domain, and I will post links to them in their entirety in the show notes, and maybe it's time for a reread. Have you two read it?
No, I've actually never heard it.
Started The Princess and the Goblin and never finished it. I think I just kind of lost interest. I don't remember why.
It is Victorian children's literature, which is kind of a mouthful. So it's not the easiest read, but I do remember being very fond of it as a younger person. For older fans, I'm going to recommend my very first reading rec from the podcast from way back in our first episode, Solace. And that was Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. I have to recommend it again because A, you should never hear the Solace episode, B, it's one of my all-time favorite books, and C, it has a character who is basically Jareth. The book is an alternate history of early 19th century England where magic is real and young ladies are abducted to fairyland by the gentleman with the thistledown hair in order to attend fancy balls. There's a BBC miniseries adaptation that's pretty good actually, but I would still recommend the book before watching it because the novel is a modern masterpiece. You've read it.
I have not.
No.
Oh, I think you would enjoy it, Kat. It's written as a faux historical document with lots of extensive footnotes.
Yes, that is
I think that's what
right
turned
up my
me off,
alley.
because I tried reading it and I think I found it. I'm not a fan of footnotes.
Oh, I love notations and footnotes, so I'm all over that.
You will enjoy this book. The man with the thistledown hair, he's definitely based on Jareth. He has to be.
Yes, I would assume so, because a lot of fairies who are described as having thistledown hair are usually by fans of Labyrinth.
Yeah.
I also have to 100% recommend something I've already mentioned on this podcast episode and many times before, and that's The 10th Kingdom, which is the first work I ever covered, back as a host in episode 3.
Can they listen to that one as opposed to Solace?
I don't know, what do you think?
I think so. I think we had our stride by then.
Oh, okay, let us know what you think if you do hear it. The 10th Kingdom is a 2000 fantasy TV miniseries at about the same all-around level as Labyrinth, I think. So now I understand why you like The 10th Kingdom so much too, Grisel.
Probably, yeah.
There's about 10 of us who have seen it, but we're all obsessively devoted to it. It's about an unhappy New York waitress who travels through a magic mirror with her bumbling father, a golden retriever who is a prince in disguise, and a self-help book reading Big Bad Wolf, into a land where fairy tales really happened. I love it beyond all reason, regardless of my attempts at objectivity back in that podcast episode, and I can say that freely now that Ashley's not here. I strongly recommend the novelization by Catherine Rusley as well, if you like Labyrinth. And, fun fact, that was the episode where you first mentioned Labyrinth, Grisel, and where I told you I had seen it, even if you didn't remember it.
Well, I think I mentioned it so many times that by now it's all blended into one.
And since you're not going to mention it, I will. Howl's Moving Castle?
Yes.
The book by Diana Wynne Jones, which you chose for episode 7, Grisel, it's very Labyrinth-like.
Yes, it is.
It is an excellent book that remains one of her highest rated works to date on the podcast, and Hal and Jareth are pretty much the same person.
As we've said before, Grisel is a type.
I think he's wearing those same very thin
Yes,
white
he is.
pants. What if Hal based his entire personality on Jareth? Is there a fanfiction crossover on that?
I am certain somebody has crossed over Labyrinth and Diana and Jones.
Well, I mentioned it briefly before, and it's actually one of the books on Sarah's shelf in the beginning of the movie, so I'll start with The Wizard of Oz. Both the 1939 film and the book written by L. Frank Baum. The movie may well be the very first fantasy film I ever saw, and it still holds a special place in my heart. My love for gingham fabric can be directly traced back to this movie. I didn't read the book until I was an adult, but I found it to be just as sweet and charming as the movie, albeit with even more adventures and worlds for Dorothy to explore. There are a lot of similarities to Labyrinth, including the personality traits of the three companions that the lead character picks up along the way.
I agree. It wasn't until watching it this time that I was like, hey, this kind of is a lot like Wizard of Oz.
I think they're purposely, they sort of all have characteristics. And I think that may be why they're all male companions, to be sort of a direct line to Wizard of Oz.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah.
It could be.
So I heard on a previous episode that Griselle is not a fan of Guillermo del Toro, but I do feel obligated to recommend the 2006 movie Pan's Labyrinth. I think what sets this movie apart from other stories of girls traveling to mythical lands in order to complete a series of tasks to break a spell is the way the movie weaves in the real life of the main character, Ophelia.
I have some background for you, Kat. That was actually our former host's pick for our April episode. And Griselle and I vetoed it rather vehemently, which is how we ended up talking about Pacific Rim instead.
We had enough traumas in our life regarding that film.
I believe Griselle and I referred to it as the film equivalent of a Dementor.
Yes.
It's a very, very dark movie. And I think what I like about it is the ties to history, and it sort of gives, because it takes place in 1944, and I'm sort of a buff about World War II history, it gives a really unique insight into that time period in Spain. Mm-hmm. And it is a traumatic movie, though. And all of the fantasy stuff comes out of trauma. So it's sort of hard to take. But I kind of like a darker, more creepy movie. So for me, it works. And the creature work in that is also really good.
Yeah.
And I would be remiss if I did not recommend one of my favorite series about a girl on a magical journey, the His Dark Material series by Philip Pullman. A series that incorporates string theory, theology, and talking polar bears is right up my alley. So I loved it. I think they make really good audiobooks as well. So if you've never read them, maybe listening to them will be interesting.
We're still not sponsored by Audible.
But...
And I'm anxiously awaiting the new adaptation that's coming out from BBC Television that's supposed to be released sometime this year. The movie that came out a few years ago was not great, although I still kind of liked it because I love the book so much that I want to like the movie.
Yeah. Another excellent opinion. I agree with you.
And for more of a thematic similarities to Labyrinth type of recommendation, I would say the 2006 album Ease, which is spelled Y-S, by harpist and singer Joanna Newsom. Each of the 5 songs on the album tells a fable-like tale, with intricate lyrics weaving themes ranging from the bond of sisters, unhealthy relationships, astronomy, moving on from heartbreak, and mortality. And this is all accompanied by swelling orchestral arrangements. As I said, the album is only 5 tracks, and yet it clocks in at around 56 minutes, so you have to be willing to listen to very long songs, and Joanna Newsom's voice can be divisive, so just know that going in. Also, the orchestral arrangements were done by Van Dyke Parks, who worked with Brian Wilson on the album Pet Sounds, which is one of my all-time favorites.
Well, I think those are all excellent recommendations, and we thank you, Kat, for coming on and giving us some insight and sharing your feelings about Labyrinth.
Yes, thank you for joining us, Kat.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure, and I hope to come back again.
We hope to have you back. That concludes this episode of the Bluestocking Circle podcast. For show notes, visit thebluestockingcircle.com. Find us on Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, Pinterest, and pretty much everywhere at Bluesock Circle. That's Blue, S-O-X, Circle. Email us at thebluestockingcircle@gmail.com and join the conversation. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, and YouTube, so please rate, review, and subscribe to help us grow.
Cheers!
Before we begin... Before we... we're going to say begin. Before we... I keep like...
It's a tricky word.
I keep having issues with that beat. Before we begin, know that we will spoil...
One more time.
No. Barely got it the first time.
No. Is stuck babysitting her baby... Hang on.
See the bees?
No, damn it.
That alliteration.
The very first time I got a $20 bill, I held it in my hands and said, oh, if I lived in Little House on the Prairie times,
you'd be a millionaire.
All the things I could buy with this $20.
Fun fact, my cat was named Sir Didymus.
Aww.
But on a side note, speaking of our...
I did this morning put a little stuffed fox on top of my cat to sort of recreate that. And it was very cute, I have to say.
Did you take a picture?
I didn't. He moved too quickly.
Oh.
It is hard to get them to stop moving. I never said I was a good singer. I just said I used to be in chorus. There's a lot of voices to cover up the bad.
I was in chorus too, and for a long time I would just open my mouth and not sing.
There you go.